ayahuasca is a male spirit that brings the trance state and or what they would call mareación, and that the chacruna plant is the female spirit that brings the visions. So if you are a psychedelic assisted therapy training program, you can't, by law, have your students go do psychedelics because the laws prohibit it. So, in the one hand, you're training people to lead people through psychedelic experiences, but the law isn't caught up yet.
Mm.
So you can't actually encourage someone to do that for training purposes. You can't just go, like, you can't go to college and your teacher's like, okay, tomorrow we're going to take acid. Like, that you'd get arrested.
Can we expand a little bit more though? Can you help us just quickly, broad strokingly understand how does this help people so much?
I will say that even the greatest science that's been done so far doesn't have a definitive answer to that. Even like the understanding or the concept that it is an orally activated DMT experience is not a definitive perspective, and it's not one that you would actually hear an indigenous curandero use to describe the experience.
Well, Carlos, welcome to Elevated Conversations. It's great to have you on the show. Roxy and I are excited for this talk.
Awesome. I'm excited to be here.
And guys, Carlos is the director of the Ayahuasca Foundation in Peru. He's coming at us today from Massachusetts in the United States, moving between the two. And one of the reasons Roxy and I were so fascinated to have this chat with you today is that we're only quite recently out of a 4-night ayahuasca ceremony and still integrating it all, making sense of it. And having journeyed a few times before, we are quite familiar with it. But one of the things I noticed that newbies who were coming along with us noticed and wanted to know more about was about the science behind how this might actually help with mental health, anxiety. You know, there were a lot of people there who were trying to work on their Adderall addictions or work on, let you name it, actually, lots of different issues that they may have had in their life, rather than the expansion, which I always need to remember because we're there for expansion and growth and healing and etc. But let's like touch on that for a moment because I found some of what you were saying in the pre-talk we had fascinating. We know there's two different plants and they get mixed together to make this beautiful brew, right? Quite a divine brew that then when goes into our stomach helps to inhibit, let's say, the things that stop DMT being absorbed. Can we expand a little bit more though? Can you help us just quickly, broad strokingly understand how does this help people so much?
Sure. I will say that even the greatest science that's been done so far doesn't have a definitive answer to that. Even like the understanding or the concept that it is an orally activated DMT experience is not a definitive perspective, and it's not one that you would actually hear an indigenous curandero use to describe the experience. The way that an indigenous curandero or shaman, we call them curanderos in Peru, would describe it is by referencing the spirits of the plants, and that ayahuasca is a male spirit that brings the trance state and or what they would call mareación, and that the chacruna plant is the female spirit that brings the visions, and that together they open the world of spirits so that these spirits from a higher dimension can come into our environment and our space. And that is the work of the curandero in ceremony, is to open the world of spirits and then call in the spirits that they have built relationships with, and in a collaborative effort create this performance of healing that is ultimately the guidance and the channeling and the direction and the wisdom of the higher dimensional beings, these plant spirits, and in working with that curandero in that dance and that performance and that art form. And so there are tribes that don't use an admixture plant that have ayahuasca without any DMT. And Richard Evans Schultes, who was kind of the godfather of ethnobotany, described his experiences drinking ayahuasca that had no DMT in it. And he said his visions were tremendously profound, but that they were dark in colors. They were like blue and purple and red, whereas the DMT would have brightened those visions and brought in yellows and oranges and some of the other colors from our spectrum. So just to like throw that out, there is no definitive answer. There is only our subjective experiences, but I can give you my interpretations and what I've come to see over the years, which is a very important trait in the processing of sensory information. So we know that we have eyes that see, and we can see what we call the visible spectrum. But our eyes see much more light than what we call the visible spectrum. It's just that on the way from the eye to process that in the brain, it passes through the thalamus and the amygdala where sensory gating takes place. So sensory gating is essentially like, let me reduce the amount of sensory information that you get to access. If I didn't, it would be far too overwhelming. And that process is seen if you've ever seen like a very newborn baby, they're in an unfiltered state at that point. They haven't developed sensory gating yet. So they're like just experiencing it all. They're seeing everything. Unfortunately, because they're seeing everything, they can't see something. They're hearing everything, and then they develop that sensory gating pretty quickly. And what ayahuasca does is it reduces sensory gating. So it treats that part of the brain that is normally trying to protect us from being overwhelmed by too much sensory information, and it expands the amount of sensory information we have access to. That would be tremendously overwhelming, especially if you're walking down the street or driving a car. But when done in a ceremony, which is a very safe and secure environment that makes sure that it's okay to be overwhelmed by sensory information, it becomes a tremendous advantage because the more sensory information we have, essentially, the more we are experiencing or perceiving reality. And that can lend itself to tremendous insights we can use to make profound changes in our lives. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I love that. I've never heard of that analogy before, and that, education, that was really good. Because, sitting on the mat, we spend hours and hours in that ceremony, and it is overwhelming, and having a safe environment for the sensories to open up, and you couldn't have that in normal day life. It would be too overwhelming for a regular person. But it's just an insight as to what we're vibrating up to, in this ascension process, and elevating our soul and our frequency, dropping the density. We are moving into more of what we see in a ceremony, right? We're closing that gap.
In a way, I don't think we want to be in that sensory expansion state when we're driving a car, when we're trying to like, go to the supermarket or do the things that have become a part of our life. It might have been something that would have been advantageous if we were still living in a ancestral manner, being connecting to nature on a daily basis and relying on it so much. And I think at a time, most likely humans did have an elevated access to sensory information. And so in a way, we've kind of become dulled, but it's been a necessity to dull our senses in order to take the progressive steps we have civilization technologically, and the fact that you and I are like communicating in this incredible way um speaks to that. Like, unfortunately, it did take some dulling, but again, ayahuasca allowing us to have that expanded state is just this wonderful opportunity. I think that fear creates also the similar effect, or tremendous fear or threat to survival. So I think that when we are find ourselves in a state of tremendous fear or feel that our survival is being threatened, as a natural response to that, we also allow access. We reduce sensory gating because it might be the difference between living or dying. And so if we have added access to information, that could be really beneficial at that moment. Damn the overwhelm, just because we might need to get out of a spot, and hearing more and seeing more and sensing more could be what allows us to achieve that. But unfortunately, we can then make false beliefs and form false conceptions during that time, and they kind of exist in the entirety of the spectrum of sensory perception. Then we come out of that fear state back to like a normal operating state, but the false beliefs have a frequency that still resides in an area that is unattainable by most metrics. So that would be like a way to conceive trauma. So you have like a traumatic experience that causes the sensory gating to reduce and allow an expansion of sensory information. Then we form a false belief through a misinterpretation of the experience, most likely because we're viewing it through the lens of our fear.
Mm.
And then that false belief resides in an area of our being that we can't access. So it's very difficult for us to let go of the entirety of the false belief. And then it becomes kind of like an infection in our being that modifies in a detrimental way our behaviors. And thus, ayahuasca, by creating a safe space that is not created by fear, where you're intentionally entering into that sensory expansion, you can replace or correct those false beliefs and in their entirety actually experience the transformation of them, such that when you come back to the waking state, you now have a more accurate belief existing outside those realms, and thus you modified the behavior to be more beneficial to your well-being. How
Mm.
about that? Does that make sense?
That's great. I'm
That's
just
a good answer.
I'm mirroring it into myself and seeing, yep, yep, yep. So you've done a lot of research, Carlos, into PTSD and mental health, anxiety. What can you share with us about what you've seen in that research? What did it entail?
Well, I should say that the research, I'm so excited, and definitely a big shout out to Onaya Science for conducting the research, and Simon and Nigel Wai-Fung, who are the original researchers that came to the Ayahuasca Foundation and really like birthed the whole movement for ayahuasca research. I am excited about it because it can demonstrate to a culture that needs to have science demonstrate it. But I'm not surprised by what was found. I was expecting them to find that, except that to put it into the language of science, it was like proving it, right? It was demonstrating it in a way that people like you and me that are basically members of a scientific culture these days need to have in terms of proving it and demonstrating it to be true. I already knew it was true. And that is that people just have tremendous benefit from it. So the early research was simple psychological evaluations, measuring people's anxiety levels and levels of depression, levels of global distress, things of that nature. And then they'd have them do the evaluation after the retreat and then 6 months later. And even that research was tremendous because it showed an incredible decrease in levels of depression and anxiety and global distress. But 6 months later, they would be even lower. And so, without any treatment for 6 months, their depression would still go down even further, and their anxiety would go down even further. And that really suggests that there were permanent changes happening, that it wasn't just because of the ayahuasca experience as on like maybe a neurotransmitter or chemical level,
Mm.
the way that an SSRI might provide benefit, but that it was actually consciousness transformations that left lasting impacts that would continue to improve well-being in terms of the metrics of anxiety and depression, even without drinking ayahuasca anymore. So that was really great to like be able to show that and to demonstrate that. Then they looked the next like phase of the research began looking at epigenetics. So they actually started taking genetic samples before a retreat and then after a retreat and then 6 months later, in addition to the psychological evaluations. And they were targeting, in the beginning, they were targeting three genes that were already known to be associated with emotional trauma. And one of those genes, Sigmar 1, is a gene that almost everyone would have, but it wouldn't be activated. It wouldn't be like shown and influence our operation unless we had trauma. And so it was like a genetic marker of emotional trauma. If you had your Sigmar 1 gene activated, then most likely you had experienced emotional trauma. And after a retreat, that Sigmar 1 gene was shown to be deactivated,
Oh, that's
which then suggested, like on a genetic level, that you could demonstrate the resolution of emotional trauma through attending an ayahuasca retreat. And that could be demonstrated through the activation and deactivation of a gene that's already been associated with emotional trauma. And so now we're at another phase of that research, which has been going on for the last 2 years in collaboration with Heroic Hearts Project, which is an amazing organization that provides funding for military veterans to attend ayahuasca retreats. It covers their costs and also provides counseling and preparation and integration counseling. It's a really fantastic organization started by Jesse Gould in the US, but now there are branches in the UK, Australia, and Canada. And so we've been receiving veterans through that organization, all of whom have a PTSD diagnosis when they arrive. And then they're evaluating them for PTSD after a retreat, but they're doing now a full global spectral analysis. So not just targeting specific genes, but just all the genes to
wow.
see if there are a lot more genes that are being activated or deactivated as a result of attending the ayahuasca retreat. But just in the evaluations, and that research hasn't been published. That'll be published by March. It should be published, if not sooner. But we've had 46 veterans come down to do our 10-day retreat, and all of them had PTSD diagnoses, and now none of them have PTSD diagnosis. So
Wow.
Wow.
100% of the veterans with PTSD resolved their PTSD as a result of attending a 10-day ayahuasca retreat in Peru. So that's pretty remarkable. Those are pretty serious numbers. That research has been looked at by Rick Doblin from MAPS, who is definitely a pretty strong authority and did a PTSD study on MDMA, which showed, I think, a 67% percent rate of success. And he also commended the research team for doing good research. And so that research will be published soon. That the documentation of that too was filmed this year. So next year there'll be a documentary film that will be showing the veterans through that process and mentioning the research as well.
That's
Oh,
great.
so
So
good.
what they sat 10 times with the medicine, or is it no?
No, it's a 10-day retreat. It has 5 ceremonies,
Okay.
but the retreats that we operate in Peru, they're a really comprehensive healing package. And that would be like what is most common in the Amazon. So while there are 5 ceremonies, there are also a digestive system cleanse with a plant called Sangre de Grado. There's a circulatory system cleanse with a plant called Piñón Colorado. There's a plant taken to increase sensitivity called Tanti Rao. Turmeric is used as an anti-inflammatory. Turmeric is a plant from the jungle. It's a different variety, but it's the same species. And then there's a central nervous system cleanse using a plant called Chirixanango, a respiratory system cleanse using a plant called Mukura. There are vapor baths with 5 different medicinal plants in them as a detoxification. There are protection baths, and then there are baths to increase or attract positive energies. So there's a lot more to the retreat than just the ceremonies. Of course,
Mm.
the ceremonies are central
Mm.
because of the impact on the emotions and consciousness, but the physical systems are addressed through a series of other plant treatments and in the entirety works together. And then we add complementary practices like breath work, cacao ceremonies, yoga, meditation, and art and music therapies. So it's really like a pretty comprehensive healing program, and it is 10 days.
It sounds so good. Well done. And well done for the research and giving it a go, like going into those waters of these veterans. I think that's going to be a really fantastic documentary to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, I'm so excited about that documentary. It was brilliantly shot, but it will also include athletes with traumatic brain injuries using mushroom therapies in Oregon in the US, and heroin addicts using ibogaine in Mexico, and some other like really interesting stories. So it's kind of covering like a lot of the different uses of different psychedelic substances for healing. And there's some really cool like speakers and interviews that will be in it. It will be on Netflix for sure, or HBO. It'll be like on a big platform, and a lot of people will definitely see it next year. So I'm really, really excited about that for sure.
Awesome.
Oh, wonderful. That's so great. One of the things I've noticed is the importance of education when someone's going through a ceremony, helping them understand what the medicine's trying to show them or the experience they might have, and a lot of the power behind setting of clear intentions. Have you noticed things like that are important as well when someone's going through this, like let's call it a package, a 10-day experience?
Well, we spend a lot of time communicating with each participant before they show up. We send them a lot of materials. I put together like a preparation guide, and I've written articles on preparation, participation, and integration that I share with them. And then I do one-on-one counseling with each participant before they arrive. So we do like cover those things for sure. Um, I don't really. I'm not a huge fan of the phrase setting intention because I don't think that it's accurate. I think to me, it implies that you decide what your intentions are, and I don't think that's the case. I think everyone has their intentions and they're there. It's just how aware of them you are or how able you are to articulate them. And I do think it's a good idea to look at those and to see if you can figure out what those intentions are and thus try to articulate them or express them, because that would enhance your ability to contribute to the process. But whether you can say your intentions or not, I do believe they're there. So I guess I'm not a huge fan of the word setting, because I guess I would say more about like expressing or discovering or realizing, because I think that your intentions are definitely there. Um, but I I think that I would more prioritize self-awareness in terms of how to optimize the healing experience over intentions. I think intentions like would be a component of self-awareness, but ultimately paying attention to what are the thought programs that I have running in my head? What are the influences that shape how I interpret and perceive my experiences and myself? And what are the memories that I use as references to determine those interpretations? Like what are the experiences that I tend to use as references that might be detrimental to my well-being, that might be like built on false beliefs or traumatic experiences? And do they have a negative influence on me? And what can I learn about myself from those experiences? Like all of those activities or those endeavors to know yourself better, those create like a roadmap or at least a compass that kind of guide you when you're in that expansive state, so that you can take advantage of the increased information that you have access to, and but to be specific about it. And sometimes that's like, well, I really think something happened when I was around 8 years old. I'm not sure, but it feels like if I were to think about it before I was 8, I have really positive memories. And then after I was 8, I started acting different. I don't remember exactly what happened, but I think it had something to do with that age, that can be a great tool to go into a ceremony and know, I think I need to figure out what went on when I was 8.
Mm.
And I'm obviously using that as an example because that was my story. I had my childhood trauma happened at when I was 8, but I didn't remember. I didn't know what had happened because I do think that I suppressed that memory to protect myself as a natural defense. If I had continued to have that memory, it probably would have caused a lot more problems than it did, especially at that young age. But then in my 20s, it was still like, having a real negative impact on me. So I think we're always in a process of self-discovery or trying our best to learn more and know ourselves. But I think that in the preparation process, our intentions are embedded in that self-awareness. And so if we are endeavoring to become as knowledgeable or aware of what's going on, who we are essentially, then that is what I would have my best recommendation for preparing for an experience.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. I love that. I can see exactly where you're coming from. These filters, these false beliefs, right? The search for clarity and answers, the shedding of that, the letting go of that, those filters and perceptions from what we see life, and embracing the new, that switch is often difficult. There can be resistance.
Mm.
And sometimes I hear people say, I thought I was going to die in that ceremony or have that experience. It was like so intense. It was really upsetting, blah, 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 blah. And it's got to get to the point where it is so real and so intense that, in a sense, they go, you know what? I'm tired of fighting. I'm going to die. I give up, etc. And so often, as soon as they die or they let go or they stop resisting, on the other side of that is the beauty or the answer. And in a sense, people sometimes call that an ego death. And in the awakening scene, sometimes people go, oh, you've got to have an ego death and become the new. But that on an ayahuasca ceremony can be quite confronting. Is that sort of something you've noticed with people, that like we've often got to go through some pain and discomfort, but there's beauty on the other side?
Well, I don't know if I would say that you have to. I'd like to
Mm.
think that you don't have to,
Yeah,
but
true.
is it common? Definitely. I've come to see the entirety of the healing process as that movement, that letting go of what I call negative states of being that are essentially states of fear. They're different manifestations of fear. And I think that when you are in a state of fear, which could manifest as anger, could manifest as shame, could manifest as guilt or pride or sadness or apathy, you are viewing the world through the lens of your state of being, and the fear creates the resistance because you have a negative prediction of the unknown outcome, right? You think essentially if someone knew what I've done, they wouldn't love me anymore. They'd want nothing to do with me, or that I am not going to allow myself to be vulnerable, so therefore I'm going to like fight you rather than be vulnerable or whatever it might be. But essentially, some type of fear creates that response of resistance. And in an ayahuasca ceremony, that can be that you're like battling, and you're thinking that you're going to die.
You're
And because
talking to
that's
me
the
right
ultimate
now, Nick,
fear.
by the way. You're getting me exactly, so I'm loving this. This is terrific.
Okay, good, good, good.
Raw, ready and raw,
Yeah.
aren't you, baby?
Um, But then that what you described is like so common where you reach a place where you just have no choice but to accept it. It is the truth. And therefore, what can I do? I can't suppress the truth. I can't pretend that it's not true. I can't ignore it. It is the truth. I am this way. This is who I am. And that acceptance reduces or releases from the resistance. Acceptance to me is almost like the middle point
Mm.
where I don't have a positive prediction yet, but I've let go of my negative prediction of the unknown. And that's huge. That's a massive, massive step forward. That can be a like profound transformation in a person's life just to go from a state of fear that brings about resistance to a state of acceptance where there is no resistance. Brilliant. Awesome work.
Mm,
However, there's a whole nother side on the positive. That would be the states of trust. That's when you have positive predictions of the unknown outcomes. And that's when you begin to enter into a response of embrace. So the acceptance is kind of the neutral point. But once we move into the higher manifestations of trust, which start to manifest in the forms of love or joy or peace or gratitude, those states start to really alter the way that we perceive and interpret our experiences in a really beneficial way. And they allow us to embrace the experience. And when we can embrace the experience, that's when magical, heavenly experiences start to become our reality. And that's what people tend to like talk about when you hear those magical stories of personal transformations with ayahuasca. So that's really what how I perceive the healing process is that movement away from fear to the highest states of trust, which I would call faith. And I think that a shaman or a curandero is someone that resides in that state of faith. And
mm,
when they're singing to you, they're vibrating and radiating that state of being out into the ceremony, and its frequency of that energy starts to affect you. It starts to, if you are in a low frequency and you're experiencing a high frequency, it will begin to raise your frequency, which will allow you to move from negative states or low frequency states of being into higher states of being. So the state of being that we exist in is everything because it literally determines the lens through which we perceive and interpret our experiences. If you're in a state of fear, the world is a terrifying place. If you're in a state of anger, the world is an infuriating place. But it also is an energy that you radiate out into the world, and the world responds according to the energy that you radiate through your state of being. So I might see the world as an infuriating place because I'm in a state of anger, but also the world will treat me differently because I'm radiating that state of anger. And we know that to be true. If you encounter an animal that's terrified and fearful, you treat it much differently. Or if you encounter a dog that's very angry, you don't pet it. But if you treat a dog that's full of joy, then you're happy to pet it. So we treat our the world treats us and we treat others according to that state of being. And also, we see and interpret the world according to our state of being. So, moving from a state of fear to a state of trust and hopefully ultimately the state of faith, that takes care of all your problems.
good
Well, I
analogy.
didn't
The
know
dog
that's what I
analogy.
did, but that's what I did. Exactly what you just, I was so scared. And it's like, I'm lying there thinking, I've done this lots of times before. What the hell am I scared? She wouldn't tell me. It's like I had to walk up in tears, so scared, not knowing what I was scared of. And she said, the only way you're going to know is if you face your fear, because I did not want to have another cup. I was like, done. I'll never have an ayahuasca again. Talk about the death thing. I'm like, this is it. Oh, no, now I brought people with me and far out. What's all this going to mean? And then she said, well, you could just open your eyes and bring yourself out of it. And I was like, no, I want the lesson. And I like kept my eyes closed. I don't know why. Anyway, I got up and I walked there and I had the second cup and I went back to my mat and she said, the fear that you felt is the same fear that you felt as a 5-year-old boy when you took your little sister down to the creek and your sister fell off the bridge into the stream and drowned, and you had to walk home and tell your mum. That was the fear of the walk. But she didn't tell me it before the walk because she probably knew I would have done it. But not knowing was worse,
Mm,
right? The fear of the unknown. So she was helping me with two things. She was helping me clear that fear that was in me from 5, but the fear that's in me now is Shit, I hope everything's going to work out. You know what? There's an underlying, I really hope the universe has got my back. I mean, I know it in the books, but you know, is this just a story everyone tells on another to make themselves feel good? So everything you said, then I can completely relate to, but it hurt. And I had the tears, the shakes. It was hard, but there was beauty on the other side. So thank you for talking that through, because just from my perspective, that was really beneficial.
Mm.
No worries, I'm glad. Um, yeah, I've come to see that I use the metaphor of a musical scale. Even if you don't know music well, I don't know it very well, but I know there are eight notes in a scale, right? And so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A is a scale in the simplest terms. That eighth note is also the first note of the next scale at the higher octave. And and that's how I've come to like perceive that world of ayahuasca that gets opened by the curanderos, and where those spirits come from to be with us in ceremony. They come from a dimension that is that octave above ours. But our eighth note and their first note are the same. So when we bring ourselves into our highest state of being, our highest frequency, our highest note, then we share the note with the spirits of that higher dimension. And in that space, we get to have that communion and that communication and receive that energy and that wisdom and guidance. And the plants want us. They really want us to come up, like, come up to this note. Like, I really want to meet you. I really want to like hang out with you. But you need to let go of that other low frequency stuff
Mm.
in order to get up here. So do that. Like,
Mm.
I'll help you to do that. I think one piece that I've also looked at is how do we respond to our recognition of a low state of being or a negative state of being? So you kind of touched on it a little bit. I heard where you're like, I'm scared. And then, okay, I'm scared. What's my next move? Like, what do I do now? What's my response to the recognition? I recognize I'm scared.
Mm.
Am I going to get angry at myself for being scared? Am I going to be embarrassed that I'm scared? What's going to play out? And that has a lot of impact in understanding who we are as well. I think sometimes we kind of double down on negative emotions,
Mm.
where we have a negative emotion and then we see the negative emotion and then we're like, get angry about it. We're like, what the fuck are you doing? Getting sad right now. Like, buck up. You've got nothing to be sad about. They're like, whoa, whoa, like, hold up.
Mm.
I'm pretty much like a little innocent kid right now. And would you say that to your kid? I hope not. And that's like another aspect of recognizing state of being and trying to learn about myself that I think has been really helpful for me, and especially plays out in ceremonies and the ayahuasca experiences.
Mm. I know what you're talking about with like doubling the emotion or making it worse for yourself. Because when I would feel uncomfortable in certain situations, the anxiety, I'd trigger the anxiety, and then I'd be like, oh no, I'm trapped. And then all of a sudden, like I've just thrown a whole nother carton of whatever crap on it to make it 10 times worse, when I could have just breathed with it and allowed it to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. And generally that would just go out gracefully without being, stirred up, again and again. So, how did you get into your research work, Carlos?
I didn't, it's, I love how many times this has happened in my life, but I was living with my first teacher, Don Juan, in his house. I lived with him for 4 years, and during that time, I got contacted by a young man named Christian Moran, who was just graduating from film school. He wanted to make a documentary, and he came down and shot a documentary with me and my first teacher, Don Juan, called Ayahuasca Diary. And we became friends. He would then later go on to become the president of a charity organization called Granttown. And when he got that position, he was essentially tasked with allocating money from this charity to do something good for the world. And he thought of me, so he reached out to me and asked if we would build a research center if he funded it. And and so I thought about that and I did a plant dieta to like get some guidance myself about it. And I walked out of the jungle having drawn the plans for the research center on a piece of paper. And and so they funded that, and a big thank you and much love to the Granttown Foundation. They've also been funding all of the veterans retreats themselves. Heroic Hearts pays for their flights, but Granttown wanted to pay for their retreats to contribute to the veterans healing processes, and they paid for the construction of the entire research center. So they essentially set that in motion. All I had to do was say yes. And then go through like 9,000 nightmares and headaches because building a research center in the middle of the jungle wasn't easy. But people would ask me like, so what are you going to do with this research center you're building? And I was totally like a field of dreams moment where I just said, well, if I build it, they will come. I just think the right people will show up. And
Mm.
that ended up being Simon Ruffle, who showed up to do a retreat and was so amazed. He was a psychiatrist, still is, and he was just so amazed at what he saw. And he proposed, like, I would love to do research. And I was like, I'm building a research center right now. And so we connected in 2016 and we opened the research center in 2017 and they started research right away.
Mm.
And so it all the pieces just like came together. It was actually Granttown, the owner of Granttown, Michael Moran, who asked me, could we do something for veterans?
Mm.
Because he wanted to contribute with the money from the charity to support veterans in some way. And we had already been doing research. We'd been operating for years, and so just like that, the next thing you know, we're on a call with Jesse Gould from Heroic Hearts, and it happened like 3 months later. We were doing the first retreat. They got the ethics approval to do it, which was crazy because it was the first time ever that they had ethics approval to have like EEG caps in ceremony with people that had never worn them before. So they were looking at brainwave data and to take blood samples and saliva samples. There was a lot of like ethics involved in the research, but because they had built relationships with their research advisors, they were able to get that really quickly and then do the groundbreaking study that really demonstrated just a tremendous efficacy of attending an ayahuasca retreat for the treatment of PTSD. So it's been just a collection of just wonderful pieces being brought together by forces that are beyond our imagination.
Mm. Magic.
Mother
Beautiful.
Nature finds a way. Mother Nature finds a way. And thank you very much for listening to the call. You know, one of the things I've noticed is that often after a ceremony, people can get guided or encouraged to leave something that no longer serves them, move into a direction where they might find more fulfillment or happiness. And a lot of people get the thought and have the dream or the idea and less take action on it, and then even less have the commitment and the character to actually follow through.
Mm.
So I want to really commend you on what you've done because I can see that you've gone through those three because it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, right? All these things, they take some effort and some problem solving, but just thank you so much for the work that you do. It's evident in your enthusiasm and your spirit coming through as you speak and as you share. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. I feel really blessed. I kind of feel like anyone, if they had had the experiences I had, would have done the same.
Mm.
Because those experiences were just uncanny. You know, they were there. It brought me to a place where I felt if I didn't do that, I would regret it for the rest of my life.
Mm.
You know, it was like that type of feeling where I just had no choice but to do it.
Mm.
And and sometimes if we can find ourselves in a place like that, decisions are pretty easy. You know, so when I look back, I'm like, that was crazy. You know, but but at the time it made perfect sense. And that's pretty much where we've been like each step of the way.
Mm.
Right now we're about to do something really cool. Like maybe by the time this airs, actually we'll have our new website launched and that will have a new program that is a therapist retreat. So it's for psychedelic assisted therapists to attend a retreat that has a plant dieta so that we'll be able to teach the ideologies and methodologies of the ancestral traditions to psychedelic or upcoming psychedelic assisted therapists such that they can incorporate according to their own intuition and what makes sense to them elements of those ideologies and methodologies into their practice of psychedelic assisted therapy when they go back and start this newly emerging field so that it is
Mm.
guided and developed by ancestral wisdom and specifically the wisdom of those plant spirits that come to visit us in the ayahuasca ceremonies. And even if they work with psilocybin or ketamine or whatever modality they might end up with, having that guidance will, I think, enhance their abilities and enhance the therapies that get developed. So I'm super excited about that. That's become a real passion for me to play a role in contributing to the development of this new field that is psychedelic assisted therapy in a way that honors the ancestral traditions and allows that wisdom to be incorporated into a new form of medicine.
Mm, that's fantastic. So where can people find that website, Carlos?
It is the same website that I currently have, the ayahuascafoundation.org, but I'm like refreshing the website so it will look entirely different. Like if you go to it this week, or I don't know when this will air. So if you went this week and then went in 2 weeks, you'll see it'll be totally different.
Wonderful.
But it's kind of a new vision for me. I became certified in psychedelic assisted therapy this year, and I saw that there were three primary, I guess, spaces that needed improvement as I saw it. And one of those spaces was definitely that the psychedelic assisted therapists in my cohort, like doing the training, who ultimately got certified just like I did, 70% of them had never even had a psychedelic experience.
Oh,
And
Seems
that
crazy.
seems kind of
I
crazy
can't believe
from
it.
our perspective, but how many doctors have ever done chemotherapy? Like we
yeah,
don't really
this is
have a
true.
system that doctors like need to do the treatments they prescribe. Unfortunately, I think that would be brilliant if they did. That's how the Shipibo tradition in the Amazon is. You can't give a plant medicine that you haven't taken, and I
Yeah.
really respect that.
Mm,
But there's a lot of red tape in that. So if you are a psychedelic assisted therapy training program, you can't, by law, have your students go do psychedelics because the laws prohibit it. So in the one hand, you're training people to lead people through psychedelic experiences, but the law isn't caught up yet.
mm.
So you can't actually
Make
encourage someone to do that for training purposes. You can't just go, like you can't go to college and your teacher's like, okay, tomorrow we're going to take acid. Like that you'd get arrested. So so we can like overcome that challenge by providing the programs we do in Peru where it's totally legal and celebrated as a national heritage. The second gap was that
mm,
currently psychedelic assisted therapy is based on psychotherapy, and that is much more of a one-on-one therapy, which I don't think addresses the epidemic of loneliness that is really infecting modern culture, and group ceremony settings like we do in the ayahuasca traditions definitely do address that epidemic of loneliness. In fact, there is this tremendous bonding that happens when you're in a group of ceremony participants and you share with each other and you support one another in a way that provides tremendous benefit that you wouldn't get if you were just going to see your therapist to talk therapy, like psychotherapy might be. I do think psychotherapy is very valuable, but that it should have a complement, which would be the group ceremony setting that we would hopefully be able to kind of train people into or provide guidance for in the creation of that. And then that third element is the concept of mentorship. In the ancestral traditions or in the Shipibo ayahuasca traditions that we work in, the new student sits next to the maestro. And that's just how it is. And maybe you have like the maestro and then like number one assistant, number two assistant, and this new student. And that's like the team. And it's already built. And that new student slowly observes, learns, and eventually gets responsibilities. And they work their way up till eventually they become that person who is the ceremony leader. In a psychotherapy model, it's not very easy to do that. You can't, if you had a psychedelic session as a psychotherapist with your patient, and then you're like, oh, by the way, Freddie's going to come in to our session because he's going to observe and
Yeah.
learn. It would have an impact on the quality of the session, and the participant might lose that sense of trust that gave them the comfort to be vulnerable and enter into a space of healing. And now that might be affected by the presence of this person that they don't know very well. But in a ceremony setting, that's not the case, or not nearly the same impact. If someone comes in and sits behind the curandero in your ceremony, you're not like, oh my gosh, who's that person? Is that going to make a big difference in my experience? You don't really give it too much thought. And thus, that person has the opportunity to learn and observe and slowly work their way up to a place of expertise and mastering such that they can become that ceremony leader. So, that mentorship, the addressing of the epidemic of loneliness in the group ceremony setting, and then just providing the profound transformational experience through psychedelic use to psychedelic assisted therapists or future psychedelic assisted therapists, to me, would have tremendous value. So
Mm.
that's really our goals with the new program.
That's great. I love it. I love seeing the training and in the ceremony. You're correct. It's like it's actually beautiful having your brothers and sisters there. The mindset before your first ceremony is that, oh, what if I do something embarrassing and, get nude and run around? It's like, no, the medicine's gonna help you and feel protected. And everyone in the room, the shamans, they're all beautiful and loving brothers and sisters that want the best for you. So it's such a different energy once you actually experience this for the first time. And I think the room is orchestrating so much more of the journey than if you were by yourself. So totally agree with some of those points that you were making there. It's a beautiful thing, in the jungle, all the animals are sleeping together and snuggling up with one another, and that feels natural and normal, And today in society, we're all separate in different rooms, and but yeah.
And I think for anyone who's watching this and has never sat with ayahuasca before, but they've found this on YouTube or whatever, and they're watching this video, what my suggestion would be very careful where you do ayahuasca. Don't be quick to rush off to someone's basement or backyard somewhere with someone, who sat with ayahuasca 6 times before and now they're a shaman. I would be particular where I have my first experience, and I would I would use caution in making sure they choose the right place to
Mm,
actually have this experience. I feel like that is very, very important. I
mm,
understand it's more effort to go to Peru, and it's more effort to spend an extended period of time, at a retreat, rather than just saying, well, I did one night of ayahuasca and I can cross it off the list. My suggestion would be to them, the extra effort and time that might be involved is out of proportion to the effort and the energy involved in getting there. It's
mm,
like very, very important.
mm,
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that you can get there with shorter programs, but I think that you would do more shorter programs. Like you almost have a two steps forward, one step back situation where you go on a weekend, which has become common outside of the Amazon. You do a couple ceremonies, then you go back to life on Monday. And by the end of the week, there's been a regression in the progress you made over the weekend, but you're still ahead, and then a couple months later, you go back and you do another weekend. And, maybe by the end of the year, you've made some significant progress because you have continuously gone back. And I think that's a totally understandable approach for someone that can't get away to go to the Amazon rainforest.
Yeah.
But what we try to provide is here it is, everything, all the entire transformation, and your life will never be the same again, type of experience. And I think that That's definitely possible. And I don't want to say it's one and done. People do come back sometimes, but our goal really is to have that profound transformation that changes your life forever.
Mm.
And I think it does take more than just a weekend to be able to do that. We had to actually talk about the 10-day retreat if it was enough time, because we started with the 18-day retreat, and then people were contacting me saying, I can't get that much time off of work. Is there a way to do a shorter program? And so I created the shortest program that I thought we could still achieve our goals with. And that ended up being the 10-day retreat with 5 ceremonies. But I want to say one thing, if it's okay, about what you were just talking about. There's so much nuance, and I think that my perception of the ayahuasca tradition, which I find to be much more helpful for me at least, is to view it as an art form. I think that medicine gets tied to science quite a bit. And so we have this kind of rigorous training to become a doctor where you have to go to 6 years. I don't know what it is in your country, but it's a lot of years, and it stresses people out. By the time they become a doctor, they've like experienced tremendous trauma from becoming a doctor, and then they're on like SSRIs just to deal with it or something. But the idea is like you get that certificate and now you're a doctor. And maybe there's like a measure like, oh, you went to Harvard, or oh, you went to this medical school in the Caribbean, or something like that, as some type of measurement. But there's a joke like, what do you call a med student that graduates last in their class? A doctor. Like there's still a wide spectrum of the quality of care that you'll receive, and so much of that is about the individual and not about the level of training or anything like that. And I think art form puts that into perspective wonderfully. Like I've never looked at a painting and cared how long they'd studied art. It was an irrelevant consideration in my feeling of how moved I am by this artwork. I've never listened to a piece of music and said, where did they study music? It doesn't mean anything to me. It's just about what that music does for me. And I think that actually makes more sense, even in modern medicine. We should really be determining the person that we're choosing to put our trust in to help guide us through a healing experience based on how we resonate and how we're moved by them as an individual, and not so much like trying to list off the qualifications, because I just don't think that they're that relevant when it comes down to it, the same way that they're not relevant in art. Like
Mm.
we don't care whether you went to Juilliard or never learned to read music. The music that you play either moves me or it doesn't. It resonates with me or it doesn't. And that's not dependent upon those qualifications. How many years you painted doesn't matter to me as to whether I want to put your painting on the wall. They're kind of irrelevant qualifications once you put it into the context of artistic expression and what resonates and moves a person. And I think that is actually a more accurate way of understanding medicine and healing.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's so true. It's like, how do you even put like what we do, energy healing, with, there's no qualification for that really. So it's just like, by their works you shall know them, and that would be in resonance with you. So thank you so much for coming on Elevated Conversations
Oh,
podcast today,
so good.
Carlos. You've got a beautiful energy. Thank you for what you're doing with the world. For everyone, and for anyone looking to go to a retreat or do the healers retreat that you were mentioning before, we'll put the details below, and yeah, you'll be able to ask Carlos questions if you feel called. And is there anywhere else that people can find your work, Carlos?
Well, I have done a number of podcasts, so you can look me up and find me that way. I list them on our website, so pretty much everything you can access through the website, ayahuascafoundation.org.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Carlos.
Thank you. It was wonderful connecting with you.